Hey there. In this video, I'm going to be comparing the two editions of Red November, designed by Bruno Faidutti and Jeff Gontier, and published by Fantasy Flight. On the left is the 2008 edition, on the right, the 2011 revised edition, both of which are in the Fantasy Flight silver line, but the silver line has changed over time. So for a while it was in this very small, narrow box, and then later on into this larger square box, but still much smaller than, like, for example, a standard Ticket to Ride size box. Smaller in all dimensions. I'm very interested in artistic choices, like when you're revising an edition, at some point somebody decides, hey, let's reverse the image. We had the submarine facing left. Let's mirror it for the revised edition. Why? What was wrong with the previous way? I'm just curious about those sorts of decisions, how they come about. Yes, that top game is very, very small. There are a number of games in this small, narrow size, including Colossal Arena, which I've covered previously. There is some appeal in having a small box, of course, especially for games that are mostly just cards. This is not the case. This is a board game. Again, I find it interesting, the artistic choices that you make when you're doing a revised edition. You keep most of the text, but then you change some of it. Bad times have hit the Red November versus hard times. Can you make it until help arrives? Becomes, can you survive? Also, at least in one part, they called the Red November the Red Gnovember. I know it would still be pronounced November. It's supposed to be a nod to the fact that they're gnomes. In the original prototype, they weren't gnomes, they were Russian. It was basically Kursk the board game. Anybody remember the Kursk? That was that Russian submarine that sunk to the bottom of the ocean with all hands lost. Pretty grim topic for a board game, I suppose, so Fantasy Flight had to fantasy it up and make them Russian gnomes. So y'all are going to get excited about this box on the left. Look, it's just the perfect size for the components, isn't it? Not much extra space. There is in fact an insert that you could remove if you wanted to, just a tiny little one that takes up some space in the middle. A lot of people would complain about the large empty space in the revised edition. But yeah, the game could have taken up half the space if they're willing to add an extra fold to the board. But, you know, it's a standard box size that they have, and at least in one way, the larger size of the second edition is welcome. I'll explain why later. Here are the boards. The smaller one is, of course, from the smaller edition, and it is a double fold, so it folds up into 1/4 the size. The top one is from the second edition, and that is a single fold. You'll notice also that the artwork for the Kraken is a bit more ominous. Here are the boards overlapping each other. Now, one thing you'll notice is that all the rooms are numbered in the submarine. They're numbered 1 to 10, but in first edition they're numbered 1 to 0, and that's because the game comes with a 10-sided die. If you've played role-playing games that use, multi-sided dice, many-sided dice, you'll know that many 10-sided dice don't actually have a 10, they have a 0. So in the first edition they explain, like, oh, the die will show a 0, but treat it like a 10. But they still showed on the board a 0, and joke's on them, the die that they included in the game didn't have a 0, it had a 10. So they fixed that in second edition. Side by side, the larger one doesn't look crazy, like a huge amount larger than the first edition. First edition can get a little crowded because the pawns are the same size in both editions, so when you have multiple pawns in the same space, it gets kind of crowded. But moreover, Red November can play up to 8 players. I'm not saying it's best with 8 players, but it's possible. I just can't imagine 8 players playing around this tiny little board. So having a larger board for second edition is welcome. It's still small for 8 players, but it's better. First edition's rulebook is not laid out very well. The way they're formatted, they're kind of walls of text. Images that are included are mostly just decoration. They're not really used to highlight or help explain things. And it can be hard to get a big picture. There are trade-offs with having a small rulebook. Instead of including a sample turn in the rulebook, they just direct you to Fantasy Flight's website. And they don't even send you to a specific page or give you a QR code or something. They just say go to Fantasy Flight's generic page and try to search for the turn example for Red November. I just don't necessarily trust that that's still going to be there in 10 years, 20 years. Advantage of a larger rulebook is you can include that information. These tokens are hazards that can appear in the submarine. You got fire tokens, you got double-sided flood tokens, low water and high water. The smaller rectangular ones are blocked hatch tokens. So the hatches between rooms can get blocked. You put a token on the door there. The 4 larger rectangular tokens are placed on the time track for timed events. Interestingly, the first edition had slight typos in that one token on the back had a different symbol. Like they didn't match up the symbols for the fronts and the backs. But that's something that they fixed in 2nd edition. Didn't affect gameplay, but it was a mistake, albeit a very unimportant one, that they did fix. These cards sit in front of the players to remind everybody whose color is whose, but also to track the player's intoxication level. Standing upright and saluting means they are completely sober, but you flip it to its reverse side and have the 1, 2, 3, or 4 facing you depending on how drunk you are. The cards from the first edition are the same size as the other cards in the same edition, so it makes sense they just had more cards that served this purpose. Slightly weird, I suppose, if you really wanted to nitpick, that these cards are rectangular, of course. That's something also that they were able to improve upon in the 2nd edition, make them proper square cards and larger. The pawns are basically identical, with the exception of their colors. Some of the brighter colors from the first edition on the left have been toned down in the 2nd edition. You can see in particular the yellow and the light green are a little bit less bright, a little bit more muted in color. But it does mean a shift in color in, for example, the dark green pawn, which has now become dark blue. This is important to note because the time trackers, that's in the middle, are exactly the same colors. So the color shift in the pawns in the 2nd edition actually mean that the pawns are no longer necessarily the same colors as their time trackers. The cubes are placed on the tracks to determine the submarine's danger levels in 3 different areas, and there's a thicker coat of paint in the 2nd edition. And the die is slightly different in that the numbers, the digits in the 2nd edition's die are narrower. Makes it a little bit harder to read from across the table. These are event cards. First edition had white borders, which are better for wear. 2nd edition's cards are going to show wear earlier. But you also notice that the wording is very slightly changed. It's a little bit more precise. So for example, whereas fire spreads, it says a fire starts in a room next to one on fire. Makes sense. But now it says next to a room that already has a fire token. So instead of using the sort of thematic description, it uses a description that references game pieces. Other event cards, the timed events now have a bolded timed event. Make that part stand out a bit. So like I was saying earlier, like the underwater current, it says increase all low water tokens to high water. I suppose if you were a real nitpicky rules lawyer, you'd be like, how can you increase a token? I mean, it's obvious what they mean, right? But again, they spell it out a little bit better in a 2nd edition. Just flip the low water token to its high water side. Okay, guys? This is the biggest and most important change to 2nd edition. In 1st edition, the items were small tokens. Most of those things are relatively clear, I suppose, but like the duck, what does that do? It's not super clear. The cards describe what they do, so that's great. But there's another important benefit to having cards. You see, there's a variant in which as the submarine becomes more hopelessly lost, the players can turn on each other, attack each other with crowbars, try to steal the aqualung, and escape from the submarine, abandoning the rest of the crew. Pretty funny. Even though the 1st edition's rules mention that variant, it's hard to do in practice with the tokens because you're supposed to keep this information, like what items you have in your inventory, hidden, which means you have to keep these tokens face down. Cards are much better. Not only do they describe what they do in text on the cards, but if you play with that variant, you can just hold a hand of cards. Because of the tokens used in the 1st edition has to include an item summary, explaining what all these means. There's 2 included in the box. For a game that supports up to 8 players, 2 seems too few. On the other side is an action summary, turn sequence, and this information is placed on the back of the rulebook in the 2nd edition. Thanks for watching. You know, older games don't stop being good. Even though newer games come out. That's what they say anyway. Take care.